In 1973, and into the following few years, the US military was in a terrible place. Not only were they forced to withdraw from Vietnam, but public trust towards the institution was at an all-time low. Soldiers returning from combat were faced with a hostile reception, and many had become drug addicts due to the plentiful supply of heroin available in Vietnam. The military that left Vietnam was at a low point in terms of morale, discipline, and battlefield effectiveness, and these, compounded with racial tensions between soldiers and the poor leadership of officers, created an image of the US military that, 30 years earlier, at the end of World War II, would have seemed unfathomable. Somehow, however, by January of 1991, the US military was more capable than ever. When the United States began its campaign in the Middle East, beginning with Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm in the Gulf War, it bore no resemblance to the beaten and battered force that had left Vietnam. What had changed? How had the nation's armed forces managed to restore its former glory in such a short amount of time? Advances in technology, weaponry, vehicles, and military policy all contributed to the drastic improvement in the US military by the start of the Gulf War. One of the most criticized and dreaded aspects of the Vietnam War was the extensive use of draftees. Initially, those that were drafted felt a duty to serve in Vietnam. Their fathers and grandfathers had served their country in Korea and World War II, so why should they be any different? However, as the war progressed, the situation became increasingly dire, and the prospects of the United States and South Vietnam coming out on top dwindled. The draftees became increasingly anti-war, with soldiers beginning to question why they were there in the first place. They had no real stake in the conflict. The Vietnamese hadn't attacked America or its allies, and many felt that the issue of Vietnamese reunification should be left, appropriately, to the Vietnamese. In 1969, the newly elected President Nixon formed the Gates Commission to develop a plan to replace the draft, and by 1972, animosity towards the selective service draft would lead to it being, in the words of President Nixon, on standby, with the last draft call in December of 1972. It would be confirmed to be fully ended by Defense Secretary Melvin Laird following the signing of the Paris Peace Accords on January 27, 1973, officially ending American involvement in Vietnam. This was a key lesson learned from Vietnam, that using draftees that aren't willing to fight and risk their lives for a cause they don't fully believe in is not going to win a war. After 1973, the US military switched to an all-volunteer force, something the Department of Defense had been planning on doing since November of 1968. But there were concerns surrounding the feasibility of getting enough quality recruits to enlist, and if the country would be able to foot the bill. The monetary issues around an all-volunteer force stem from the fact that, with the draft, the Army didn't have to offer monetary incentives to get people to join. They were selected by a lottery system, and then that was that. Money would also be needed to advertise the Army, and also to eliminate negative aspects of military life. Lobbying for funding fixed the monetary issues, with civilians filling the less desirable duties formerly left to draftees, and coupled with new advertisements and the lowering of the number of servicemen from over 1.5 million to 785,000, the military began receiving high-quality recruits incredibly quickly, meeting recruitment quotas by November 1973, and exceeding them in the following months. The expansion of women's roles in the military opened up an untapped avenue for higher quality recruits, and, despite some initial pushback and harassment, by the beginning of the Gulf War, 8.6% of those deployed were women. In addition, training for recruits was updated to meet the needs of current conflicts, new schools being developed to facilitate new weapons and systems on the battlefield, in order to ensure soldiers were prepared for the realities of the modern battlefield, with an emphasis on rigor and raising standards for all soldiers. All these efforts to facilitate the all-volunteer force gave the US military the quality manpower it so desperately needed, and in a much faster fashion than anyone could have anticipated. Now they had the renewed manpower, the military needed a renewed doctrine, and this would arrive in the form of air-land battle. During Vietnam, the Americans were woefully unprepared for the type of war they were to fight, and this was a major vulnerability to them at the time, as their conventional tactics found limited success. The tactics of the Viet Cong worked dramatically better in the mountains and dense forests of Vietnam, and the United States had not really tried to adapt, so they began studying the ongoing conflicts such as the Arab-Israeli War, noting the use of missiles and the importance of combined arms units, and began developing a new military doctrine. Initially, the idea of active defense was the new doctrine beginning in 1976, but this would be improved upon by 1982, emerging as air-land battle. This new doctrine would require commanders to simultaneously supervise 3 types of operations: close, far, and rear. Close operations are the conventional battles, various large divisions fighting through close combat, maneuvering, and indirect fire support. Deep operations involve less direct means of waging war, utilizing deception and surveillance to disrupt enemy forces and provide intelligence to nearby combat units. Finally, rear operations proceed alongside close and deep operations, moving reserves and supplies through friendly areas, continuing logistical efforts to sustain battles, and providing continuity with command. The new doctrine took a page from the playbook of the Viet Cong, emphasizing the seizure of initiative and acting faster than the enemy could react, along with synchronizing the combat power of ground and air forces during battle. It also stressed the usage of air power and armored divisions to assist ground forces, combining the combat power of every facet of the military to fight more effectively. Furthermore, air-land battle highlighted the need for new military technology, as they knew their Cold War adversaries in the Warsaw Pact outnumbered them in sheer manpower and materials, and set about developing new technology in order to fight outnumbered and win. Budgetary restrictions prevented the US military from being able to match the Soviets and their allies in these regards, but concluded that they could use their superior technology to win battles. So, the army began work on what they called the Big Five equipment systems: a new tank, infantry combat vehicle, attack helicopter, transport helicopter, and anti-aircraft missile. Many of these weapon systems were already in development before the introduction of air-land battle, but the new doctrine would have a heavy influence on the direction development would take. The first of these new systems was a new tank. The tanks in service with the US during Vietnam were the M48 and M60, but by this time they were being surpassed, slowly but surely, by advances in Soviet technology. So, to maintain armored superiority, a new tank would be required. After funding was pulled from a number of prototype projects, the Army would build the XM1 prototype in 1976, which proved incredibly successful and became what we now know as the M1 Abrams. This tank offered better speed and protection to previous American tanks, using Chobham-spaced armor, while a sophisticated fire control system provided main gun stabilization for shooting on the move, also utilizing a precise laser range finder, thermal imaging night sights, and a digital ballistic computer to maximize the utility of the 105mm main gun. In 1985, the M1A1 Abrams was produced, having improved armor and a larger 120mm gun to improve protection and lethality. Next up was the infantry combat vehicle, and that would arrive in the form of the M2 Bradley fighting vehicle. The M113 personnel carrier being used previously was rendered virtually obsolete by advances in armor-penetrating weapons and its slow speed. So in 1980, the M2 was developed, offering not only superior armor, but also a host of weapons: a 25mm cannon, 7.62mm machine gun, and a tow missile launcher, in order to keep soldiers protected and defend themselves should the need arise, along with enabling it to be used as a scouting vehicle. The third system, an attack helicopter, would arrive in 1982. Previously, the AH-1 Cobra attack helicopter in service was extremely vulnerable to even light anti-aircraft fire, and lacked the agility to fly close to the ground for extended periods, problems that the new AH-64A Apache would rectify. Along with this, the new attack helicopter was more fiercely armed, carrying 16 heat-seeking Hellfire missiles or 76 70mm rockets, or a combination of both, whilst also having a Hughes 30mm chain gun mounted on its nose, rather than the twin miniguns and 8 missiles on the Cobra. The next system would be replacing the Vietnam Icon, the UH-1 Iroquois transport helicopter, and this was already in production, the 1974 UH-60A Black Hawk. This transport helicopter offered greater carrying capacity along with being faster and quieter than the Huey, being able to reliably lift a whole infantry squad or a 105mm howitzer with its crew and some ammunition. Finally, the fifth system, the anti-aircraft missile, and this would come in the form of the Patriot missile system, replacing the Hawk missile system in the early 80s. Despite some controversy over costs and development times. The Patriot missile required virtually no maintenance and had the speed and agility to match known threats, and a battalion armed with Patriot missiles had the firepower of several Hawk battalions. thus making the time and money investment certainly worth it. These 5 systems were not the only improvements post-Vietnam, the M16A1 rifle that was notoriously unreliable in combat being updated with the M16A2 in 1983, along with new transport vehicles to replace the World War II-era Jeeps, as well as a family of new command, control, communications, and intelligence hardware. All of the advancements made during this time period ensured that even if the US found themselves outnumbered in mere numbers of men, they could still be victorious due to the power their new technology carried, and by 1990, all of these systems were operational and ready for combat. The final piece of the puzzle was to improve the overall command structure of the US military. Since 1955, the US Continental Army Command, or CONARC, had been in charge of the various US armies across the globe, and in 1962 created the Army Materiel Command, or AMC, and the Combat Development Command, or CDC, to manage force development and control the technical services. As the Army began to withdraw from Vietnam, General William Westmoreland directed an extensive review of the Army's organizational structure to determine its effectiveness and the necessity of changes to the institution. By 1970, this review, named the Parker Panel, issued 68 recommendations for overhauls to the Army's structure, and by 1972, Lieutenant General William Dupuy began breaking up Army commands and reassigning their functions despite protests from CONARC and CDC leaders. Named the Steadfast Reorganization, it replaced the large CONARC body with smaller functional commands, those being FORSCOM, TRADOC, and AMC. FORSCOM is the new Army Forces Command, and assumed command of all active and reserve Army forces, consolidating the existing 6 armies into 3 Continental United States Armies, or CON-USAs, with a heavy focus on combat readiness. TRADOC is the Army Training and Doctrine Command, which combines all military schools along with the combat development functions inherited from the Army's previous Combat Developments Command. Finally, AMC is the previously mentioned Army Materiel Command, which specializes in Materiel Development and Logistics Command, also providing maintenance work and parts to the various sectors of the military. This reorganization of the Army Command increased the effectiveness of the military and streamlined its structure, as each new command had specific responsibilities and agendas unique to them, leaving no room for overlaps or confusion about their tasks. Vietnam had given the US military a taste of defeat, and with the changes they made after withdrawing, they aimed to never have to experience that again. A new high-quality and willing armed force, improved weapons technology, a new military doctrine, and a reorganized army rebuilt the US military back into a true fighting force. But one problem remained. This military was still untested. There had been small conflicts during the Steadfast Reorganization, such as the US invasions of Grenada and Panama, but nothing near the scale and significance of Vietnam, and even so, the invasion of Grenada is considered a slight embarrassment for the United States. The changes made to the military took many years to implement, and now that they were operational, the United States felt prepared to combat any foe around the globe. And in August of 1990, the stage was set for a showdown between the renewed American military and the formidable Iraqi army that had just invaded Kuwait, and would let them know, in no uncertain terms, if their changes had restored their military prowess.